In 1882, one prison guard claimed he spent weeks watching a captive unlike any man history remembers. Every night, the giant whispered the same chilling sentence through cold iron, bars, and those words haunted him for the rest of his life. If you love forgotten mysteries where history, legend, and the unknown collide, subscribe now and step into the timeline they never expected you to question. The year was 1882. America was changing faster than ever before. Railroads stretched across the continent, factories reshaped entire cities, and the country looked toward the future with confidence. But beyond the crowded streets and growing skylines, there were places that seemed untouched by progress, isolated government facilities where rumors traveled farther than facts. According to an old and disputed legend, one such prison stood far from public attention, surrounded by dense forest and guarded as though it held something too dangerous to be seen. The building appeared on no public maps, and official records describing its purpose have never been verified. Whether it truly existed or became part of American folklore remains a mystery. The whispers surrounding the prison all pointed to a single cell. It was said to be larger than every other cell in the building. The iron bars were unusually thick. Heavy chains were anchored deep into solid stone, and guards were instructed never to approach alone after sunset. No explanation was ever offered. Questions were discouraged. Orders were expected to be followed without hesitation. Then came the story that transformed local rumor into lasting legend. The prisoner was described not as an ordinary criminal, but as a towering figure whose size seemed impossible by any accepted standard. Witnesses claimed that even while seated, the captive appeared larger than the tallest guard standing outside the cell. Some believed he was merely an unusually tall man. Others insisted he belonged to something far older than recorded history. No verified photographs, court documents, or government files have ever confirmed these claims. Yet the tale endured because of one man, the final guard assigned to watch the mysterious prisoner. He kept silent for years, and when he finally spoke, he asked a question that no historian has ever been able to answer. Why was no official record ever allowed to exist? The man at the center of the legend was said to be Elias Mercer, a quiet prison guard whose life had always been defined by routine rather than adventure. Unlike the lawmen celebrated in newspapers, Mercer never chased outlaws or stood in dramatic courtroom trials. His world consisted of long patrols, heavy iron keys, and the echo of boots against stone corridors. According to the story, he accepted a transfer in the autumn of 1882 to an isolated government prison that paid more than any ordinary assignment. The reason for the higher wages was never explained. New guards were simply told to follow orders, avoid unnecessary questions, and never discuss their work beyond the prison walls. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Each morning began before sunrise. Mercer inspected locks, counted supplies, and walked the same silent hallways with military precision. The prisoners remained hidden behind thick doors, and every shift ended with the same feeling of uneventful repetition. But one corridor was different. It remained locked, except during scheduled inspections. 2 armed guards always stood outside its entrance, and even senior officers lowered their voices whenever they passed through it. No names appeared on the records for the cell beyond. Only a number, written in faded black ink, marked its existence. On his 7th night, Mercer was handed a ring of unfamiliar keys. Without explanation, his captain ordered him to relieve the previous watchman. The older guard hesitated before leaving. As the legend tells it, he looked Mercer in the eyes and offered only a single warning. "Whatever speaks to you, don't answer." Mercer dismissed the words as superstition. He unlocked the heavy iron gate and stepped into the dim corridor alone. At the very end, illuminated by the weak glow of a flickering lantern, something enormous shifted behind a wall of iron bars. The prisoner was unlike any man he'd ever seen. The corridor fell silent. Only the slow crackle of the oil lantern disturbed the darkness as Elias Mercer took another, cautious step toward the final cell. According to the legend, every instinct told him to turn back. The figure inside remained motionless at first, hidden beneath layers of shadow. Then, as the lantern's light reached the iron bars, Mercer finally understood why no ordinary prison cell could contain its occupant. The prisoner was enormous, not merely tall, but impossibly proportioned. Broad shoulders filled nearly the entire width of the stone chamber. Massive hands rested calmly upon bent knees, each finger appearing thick, enough to wrap around a man's wrist. Even seated on the cold floor, the captive's head nearly reached the arched ceiling above. Yet it wasn't the giant's size that unsettled Mercer the most. It was the silence. There was no rage, no desperate pleas for freedom, no clanking of chains, only a patient stillness, as though the prisoner had been waiting, not for rescue, but for someone specific to arrive. Mercer noticed details that refused to leave his memory. The giant's clothes were old, far older than anything worn in the 19th century. Heavy iron shackles circled both wrists, but they appeared strangely unnecessary, as if the chains were meant more for ceremony than restraint. Then their eyes met. The guard expected fury. Instead, he saw exhaustion. An ancient sadness seemed to rest behind the prisoner's steady gaze, carrying the weight of countless forgotten years. The air itself felt heavier. Mercer reached for the keys at his belt, unsure why his hands had begun to shake. Every story he'd dismissed as superstition suddenly felt painfully real. Neither man moved. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Then, without warning, the giant slowly lifted his head. His lips parted, and in a voice so calm it barely rose above a whisper, the prisoner spoke for the very first time. "You're not the one guarding me. You're the last one left to remember." Elias Mercer stood frozen. The words echoed through the narrow stone corridor long after the giant's lips had stopped moving. "You're the last one left to remember." According to the legend, Mercer searched the hallway, convinced someone else had spoken, but the prison remained silent. The other guards were stationed 2 corridors away. There was no one close enough to whisper through the darkness. He looked back at the prisoner. The giant hadn't moved. His enormous hands still rested calmly in his lap, and his eyes remained fixed on the flickering lantern rather than the man standing beyond the bars. Mercer tried to dismiss what he'd heard. Perhaps exhaustion had played tricks on his mind. Long shifts in an isolated prison could make anyone imagine things. Then the whisper came again, softer this time, almost gentle. "The walls can hear us." A cold shiver climbed Mercer's spine. He instinctively glanced toward the ceiling, expecting hidden guards or some unseen listener. There was nothing except rough stone and decades of dust. Night after night, the same pattern repeated. The giant never shouted, never begged for food, never demanded freedom. He only whispered. Sometimes he spoke of places with mountains so vast they disappeared into the clouds. Sometimes he described rivers that no modern map recorded, cities carved from a single piece of stone, and stars that seemed to belong to a different sky. Mercer wrote nothing down. He feared that seeing the words on paper would somehow make them more real. Yet one evening the giant's voice changed. The calm disappeared. For the first time, genuine urgency entered his whisper. He slowly leaned toward the iron bars until his weathered face emerged from the shadows. His eyes locked onto Mercer's. Then He spoke a sentence that the guard would later claim haunted every remaining year of his life. "They didn't build this prison to keep me inside." He paused. His voice dropped almost below hearing. "They built it to keep you from learning what existed before your history began." The words weren't a plea. They were a warning. After that night, the prison began to change. Or perhaps, according to the legend, it was Elias Mercer who had changed. The familiar stone corridors no longer felt ordinary. Every footstep echoed longer than it should have. Every shadow seemed to linger just a little too long before disappearing into the darkness. Mercer noticed the differences immediately. The guards, who once joked during the night watch, now spoke in whispers. Some avoided the eastern corridor entirely, inventing excuses to trade shifts or volunteer for kitchen duty instead. Others refused to even mention Cell 7, as though saying its number aloud invited something into the room. One by one, they stopped walking past the giant's cell. When Mercer asked why, the answers were always the same. "You hear things down there. The walls aren't empty. Don't stay after midnight." No one explained further. One rainy evening, Mercer arrived for his shift and found an older guard hastily packing his belongings. The man's hands trembled as he shoved uniforms into a worn leather bag. "I quit," he muttered without looking up. Mercer asked what had happened. The veteran guard hesitated. Finally, he leaned close enough that only Mercer could hear. "Last night, the giant knew my daughter's name." Mercer froze. The man had never spoken about his family inside the prison. Not once. By sunrise, he was gone. No resignation papers. No farewell. Only an empty bunk and unanswered questions. The strange incidents continued. Lantern flames flickered violently in the eastern corridor, even when there wasn't a breath of wind. Heavy iron doors were discovered standing open despite being locked only moments earlier. Several guards swore they heard deep footsteps echoing through the prison after midnight, yet every prisoner remained accounted for. The officers blamed old foundations, fatigue, overactive imaginations. But Mercer noticed something no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Every unexplained event happened only after the whispers began. And every morning when he returned to Cell 7, the giant was already awake, waiting, as though he knew exactly who would come next and exactly how much time they had left. As the nights passed, Elias Mercer found himself doing the one thing he'd promised he would never do. He listened, not because he believed the giant's stories, but because every whisper carried details no ordinary imagination should have known. According to the legend, the prisoner never claimed to be a king, a warrior, or a prophet. He claimed to be a witness. "I have watched empires rise from dust," the giant whispered one night, "and I have watched them disappear so completely that even their names became strangers to the wind." Mercer remained silent. The giant continued. He spoke of immense stone cities hidden beneath forests that had not yet existed when the cities were built. He described roads stretching farther than the eye could see, carved with impossible precision across mountains now buried beneath centuries of earth. He never spoke with pride, only sorrow. "The world remembers the victors," he said quietly. "It forgets the builders." Night after night, fragments of a forgotten civilization emerged through the bars. The giant described towers that reflected the stars like polished glass, rivers redirected through solid rock, and libraries where knowledge was etched into stone because paper could not survive the ages. Mercer wanted to dismiss every word as fantasy, yet one detail refused to leave his mind. The giant described a valley surrounded by 3 black cliffs where a staircase had been, carved directly into the mountain. Hidden beneath the lowest step, he claimed, rested a stone marked with symbols no scholar of 1882 had ever recorded. Then the giant looked directly into Mercer's eyes. "For centuries," he whispered, They searched in the wrong places. If anyone ever finds that stone, they'll know I never lied. For the first time since accepting his assignment, Mercer realized the story offered something more than mystery. It offered evidence. Not proof, not certainty, but a single trail that could be followed, a single forgotten place. Because sometimes history begins with one question, and sometimes one impossible claim can be tested. The giant's words refused to leave Elias Mercer's mind. For days, he replayed every whispered sentence, every impossible detail, every strange certainty in the prisoner's voice. If the stories were nothing more than delusions, then the records would prove it. According to the legend, Mercer began searching where no ordinary guard was expected to look. Late one evening, after the prison had fallen silent, he slipped into the administrative wing. Hidden behind rows of ledgers was a narrow archive room, its shelves crowded with decades of prisoner logs, transfer orders, and handwritten reports. Dust covered everything. The room smelled of old paper and lamp oil. Mercer searched for cell 7. Nothing. He checked the prisoner registry again. Still nothing. Every occupied cell had a name, a sentence, and a date of arrival, except the one he guarded every night. Puzzled, he moved deeper into the archives until he discovered a locked cabinet marked "Restricted." Inside were bundles of documents tied with faded black ribbon. Several pages had been torn out, others had been burned around the edges, leaving only fragments of sentences behind. One surviving page mentioned an unusual transfer, authorized in the spring of 1882, but the prisoner's identity had been carefully cut away with a blade. Another referenced construction expenses for reinforced foundations beneath the eastern wing. No explanation followed, only blank space where entire paragraphs should have been. Then Mercer noticed something even stranger. The missing pages hadn't disappeared with age. They had been removed deliberately. Every cut was clean, every name erased with precision. It wasn't neglect. It was intention. As he gathered the surviving fragments, a loose envelope slipped from between two ledgers. Inside was a single photograph. The eastern corridor, cell 7. Standing outside the bars were 6 guards. Mercer recognized every face, except one. The tallest man in the picture wasn't behind the bars. He was wearing a prison guard's uniform. Mercer's heartbeat slowed. Someone had rewritten the story before he was ever told it. And in that moment, one terrifying truth became impossible to ignore. Someone had erased the evidence. By the end of October 1882, according to the legend, the prison no longer resembled the orderly institution Elias Mercer had first entered. The silence had become unbearable. Entire sections of the eastern wing stood abandoned after sunset. Guards requested transfers without explanation. Even the prison warden, a man known for his unshakable discipline, avoided walking past cell 7 after dark. Then, on one storm-filled evening, everything changed. Rain hammered the prison roof. Thunder rolled across the hills. Just before midnight, a brass alarm bell echoed through the corridors. Not once, but 3 times. Every guard knew what that meant. A full security breach. Mercer grabbed his lantern and ran toward the eastern wing, expecting chaos. Instead, he found something far more disturbing. The corridor was completely empty. No guards, no officers, only dozens of iron doors standing wide open, swaying gently as cold wind drifted through the prison. Every prisoner remained inside their cell. Every prisoner, except one, cell 7. The massive iron door stood open. The heavy chains lay twisted across the stone floor. Mercer's lantern trembled in his hand as he stepped closer. According to the legend, there were no broken locks, no shattered bars, no signs of violence. It was as if someone had calmly unlocked the cell and invited the prisoner to leave. Then Mercer noticed something impossible. A trail of enormous footprints crossed the dusty floor. They led away from the open doorway. stopped in the middle of the corridor and vanished. Not faded, not covered, simply ended, as though the giant had taken one final step and disappeared from the world itself. The storm outside fell strangely quiet. Mercer slowly entered the empty cell. The walls felt colder than before. The air stood perfectly still. On the stone floor, beneath the place where the giant had spent countless nights, lay a single object, a smooth black stone. Its surface was carved with the same unfamiliar symbols the prisoner had described weeks earlier. Mercer reached down with shaking hands. Behind him, the cell door slammed shut, and for the first time since the whispers began, the giant's voice returned, not from inside the cell, but from somewhere much closer. The next morning, according to the legend, the prison carried on as though nothing had happened. The alarm from the previous night was never mentioned. The open cell was locked once again. The broken chains were gone. Even the black stone Mercer claimed to have found had vanished without explanation. When he questioned the officers, they stared back at him with blank expressions. There was never a prisoner in cell 7. The answer was repeated so often it began to sound rehearsed. Mercer insisted the giant had escaped. The warden corrected him. Nothing escaped, because nothing was ever there. Within days, every guard who had worked the eastern wing was reassigned or dismissed. Some reportedly denied the prison had contained a 7th cell at all. Others admitted there had once been a restricted corridor, but refused to discuss what they had seen. No two testimonies matched. One claimed the prisoner was an unusually tall man. Another swore the cell had always been empty. A third insisted the whispers came from the walls themselves. As the years passed, the contradictions only grew. New prison records appeared with entire sections rewritten. Building plans no longer showed the eastern corridor. Official reports ended abruptly, as if someone had decided the story should stop before it truly began. Then Mercer disappeared from public life. He never granted interviews, never published a book, never attempted to convince the world of what he believed he'd witnessed. According to the legend, he trusted only one place with his memories, a weathered leather diary. Every strange conversation, every whispered warning, every impossible detail, he wrote them all by hand. When Mercer died, almost everything connected to his story was said to have vanished. The prison was abandoned. The records were scattered. The witnesses faded into history. But one object was rumored to survive, hidden away from curious eyes. A single diary, filled with questions no one has ever answered. Because if the legend is true, only one diary survives. So, what are we left with? A forgotten prison that cannot be verified. A giant no official record confirms. A guard whose story survives only through legend. And a diary that, if it ever existed, has never been publicly authenticated. History demands evidence. Legends survive on memory. This story stands somewhere between the two. There is no verified historical proof that a captured giant was imprisoned in America in 1882. No confirmed government archive, court record, or authenticated photograph supports the tale you've just heard. Most historians would place this story alongside folklore, prison myths, and 19th century campfire legends passed from one generation to the next. Yet legends rarely endure without a reason. Perhaps the giant never existed. Perhaps Elias Mercer was only a fictional character created to explain strange rumors surrounding an abandoned prison. Or perhaps every legend begins with a real event that becomes distorted as the years pass, leaving only fragments for future generations to piece together. That is what makes stories like this so compelling. They live in the narrow space between certainty and imagination, between documented history and the mysteries history can no longer explain. Maybe the whispers through the bars were nothing more than an old tale told to frighten young guards during lonely night shifts. Or maybe they were a warning, one that was never meant to survive beyond the prison walls. We'll probably never know, but somewhere, in an old attic, a forgotten archive, or the back shelf of a dusty library. Perhaps a weathered diary still waits to be opened. Perhaps a single missing page is still waiting to be found. And if that page ever comes to light, the greatest mystery won't be whether giants once walked among us. It will be why someone worked so hard to make sure no one would ever remember them. Until then, the bars remain empty, the whispers remain unanswered, and the legend lives on.